Okay, so remember we're talking primarily evolution, right? And so I gave you guys again the kind of the picture last week. I said we've got two different types of evolution, and that you've got like macroevolution and microevolution. So macro, basically, if you're going to give me again like the terminology, like what would you use to explain macroevolution? What are we kind of referring to? Say it again. Somebody speak up. I don't care. Big. Yeah. So okay, now a little bit more specific. In terms of evolution, what does that mean? What are we referring to? Yeah, common ancestry, right? To basically say that we have developed from organisms, millions and millions of years ago, all right? And from that, all things basically have it. And so we have ways of showing macroevolution because when you look at, there are some common things that you're going to find amongst all organisms. We'll talk about DNA sequencing here probably tomorrow, right? We are all made up of DNA, right? Coincidence? Who knows? Whatever. Okay. We'll talk about some of those things that basically lead to that common ancestry, right? Now, if we're talking microevolution, though, what are we referring to? Yeah, natural selection. Okay. So when we look at the major forms of evidence that help us to basically support evolution, right, we have kind of microevolution topics and we have macroevolution topics. What we talked about last week was all microevolution. It was all natural selection based, right? The strong will survive, survival of the fittest. Those organisms that basically are more suitable for the environment are going to go on and survive. They reproduce, they have more offspring. Population goes above carrying capacity. Organisms got to die. Which organisms are going to die? Those that don't have the suitable traits. If the environment changes, now it may be a different trait, right? Okay, and you guys kind of seen that with the lab that you did on Friday in that, well, what occurred over the course of time based on the environmental conditions, right? The number of white rabbits went down, the number of brown rabbits went up, right? Or even the allelic frequency started to change. Well, what would happen all of a sudden if that environment went to a white environment? Yeah, all the brown ones probably die off, and then we've got the white ones going, right? And so you see that change, right? Not only in the organisms, but also just in what we call the allelic frequency as well. Okay. Now, from here on out, and it's going to be relatively short and sweet, we're going to talk about kind of the more macroevolution topics. We're going to hammer out again more along the lines of how can we prove what is there the evidence, right? Or what kind of evidence is there to help us to support that this whole common ancestry theme, which again, your belief is your belief, right? There's some things I think there's some loopholes in there. I don't always believe, right? There are some things obviously I do believe when we go through, and then there's just evidence that you just can't really ignore when we start looking at it. Okay. Now, the first thing we are going to discuss, all right, so I'm going to try to break down 3 of them today. First one, we're going to talk about our fossil records, right? Second one, we're going to talk about is embryology. Third one, we're going to talk about our homologous, analogous, and vestigial structures that all organisms have that, again, can show common ancestry. Okay, now, first thing, if we're looking at fossil records, you guys tell me, okay, how can we use fossil records to give us or provide us with evidence to support evolution? What are fossils? Bones is an example. What else? Something preserved. Good. What else? Shells. Good. I mean, bones is good. Shells are good. Something preserved is good. I mean, if you ever watch Jurassic Park, for example, you've got the little mosquito that's embedded in the amber, right? I mean, naturally preserved for millions of years ago. Like that's there. Okay. It could be casts of something. Okay, it could be buried in tar pits. I mean, it could be a whole organism. It could be parts of an organism. It could be bone. It could, whatever the situation is. Okay, and whenever we are able to find those fossil records, right, that is providing us with a picture of something that was here thousands and millions of years ago. Even though there's people out there that believe that fossils aren't real. Okay, there's people out there that believe that people are just mimically, they're making up fossils to try to get us to believe in evolution. They're not real. There's nothing truthful about them whatsoever, which, whatever. If you watch the dinosaur digger guys over in Montana, Wyoming, I mean, it's pretty truthful that they're basically digging up Triceratops and everything else going on over there, right? Okay, and T-Rexes and everything else. So when we look at what fossil records will do for us, okay, one, they're providing us with basically a picture of organisms and either one similarities or also differences, right, that those organisms have compared to organisms that we find on Earth today. Now, why would there be differences from organisms millions of years ago, compared to the organisms that we are seeing today? What do you mean different? Not different structures. It's not anything about, I mean, they are different. Okay, we've got that part. But why would there be differences? Why would there be changes that occurred? Because their environment changed. Right. So now we go back to, we can utilize fossil records, but what it's actually showing us is that natural selection has taken place, right? That we've got fish, we've got mammals, we've got other organisms from thousands of millions of years ago, but there's differences. And there's similarities. There's no doubt about it. We'll explain those in a little bit, but there's also differences that you're going to find. So it's kind of showing us that over the course of the last 1,000 to millions of years, that organisms have kind of broadened out a little bit. We have developed. We have basically become more and more and more complex and more organisms itself, right? But either way, fossil records are just provide us with that. They provide us with the record. We're able to see what was here a long time ago compared to what is here now. And we can look at similarities. We can look at differences. Now, I've also told you guys in the past that anytime we deal with evolution, we can show evidence to support it. We can also do what? Not provide evidence to support it, but provide evidence to do what? Yeah, not prove none. On the other side. Not prove. Yeah, contradict it, disprove it, right? Yeah, not prove. And I think this is also where one of those loopholes come in. Because one thing you'll see, all right, with a lot of these so-called fossil records is that they'll get fossils for thousands of years. And then all of a sudden there is nothing. And then all of a sudden another 100,000 years come up and oh my God, there's another fossil. And it'll go on, they'll have more and more fossils. Then there's like, oh my God, there's another break to where it's like, what happened to this one? What happened to that one? How come there is no like natural, kind of flow into the next species as they keep talking about, as us coming from a chimp and us coming from apes and everything else down the line, right? But again, there's really no common flow in that there's all these loops, there's all these kind of breaking points, and there's all these parts where it's like, man, we don't know what happened there. So they can use it to help prove it, but it's not a foolproof evidence like you would really want to expect. Now, the other question comes up, well, how are we able to take those organisms and show this flow and show this natural kind of, basically these modifications, or show how these organisms have adapted and evolved by the process of natural selection over these thousands of years? The first thing they got to be able to do is they got to be able to determine where and when, right, these organisms were on Earth. Okay. So they've got to go back and they've got to date, right, those fossils. Right. And one of those ways that they can do it is called carbon dating. All right. And carbon dating, I can't remember if I have a question on the test dealing with carbon dating, but we will put it on anyway. So what happens with carbon dating is that we are all organic organisms, right? We're all organic, which means that we are made up of carbon. Somewhere along the lines, we have carbon inside of our body. Okay. Now carbon has a half-life, they call it, right? And that half-life is roughly around 14,000 years, meaning that for every 14,000 years, right, there will be one half the amount of carbon in that organism than what there was prior to it. If it goes another 14,000 years, it's going to get cut in half. If it goes another 14,000 years, it's cut in half. And so it just keeps getting cut in half, cut in half, cut in half. And so what they're able to do is once they get that fossil, they can determine the amount of carbon that is found in it. And then they backdate it and they say, well, this organism was here 3.4 million years ago. Or this organism was here 1.5 millions of years ago. This organism is here 340,000 years ago. And it provides us, again, kind of with this geological timeline, right, that basically you can look at from present time, and now it's going to give you these organisms were here how many millions of years ago, right? So picture that. And then you can kind of start to do what? Well, maybe this transition to this, and oh my God, look at the similarities here, but why did this organism do this? Well, how did this one all of a sudden develop? Where did it come from? And you can start again to kind of see that flow or that timeline of these individuals. Okay. Now, the other way that we can date, all right, other than using carbon, is we just simply use what they're in, what they're found in. Right. Most fossils are going to found in dirt, right? They're found in soil. Right. And if you guys know anything about erosion and deposition, erosion's what? What's erosion? This is not a tough question. What happens when something erodes? It's a breaking away. What specifically? Earth, dirt, rock, right? Exactly. And it's going to get eroded and it's going to get broken down into smaller pieces, right? Now, along with erosion, there's also what we call deposition. What does deposition mean? To demember, No. To deposit. What does it mean to deposit? Put something there, right? Exactly. So what happens when these materials basically break down into these smaller components? You've got wind, you've got water, you've got animals, whatever the case is, they'll move that soil from one place to the next. And so what you end up finding is you end up finding these layers. Okay. Now there's a couple things that show these layers. One is going to be the erosion and deposition, right? But two, you also start looking at, again, these bands in the soil are usually due to, different types of chemicals or different types of components to that soil itself. Either way, the soil that you find on top compared to the soil that you find on the bottom, this is the newer stuff. Okay, this is the stuff that has basically been deposited on top. The stuff down here is relatively old. Okay, and so as you work from top down, soil gets older and older and older and older and older. So if we can go through and we can find, well, here's a layer of soil. Okay, and you guys have been out to the Badlands before, right? Okay, you guys are basically driving in. It's not just a hill of dirt, right? It's not just basically, when you look, there are these alternating bands of reds and browns and yellows and so on, and it's usually due to different components of that soil from a different time frame on Earth, right? And so what you're able to find is that if we can find organisms that are found in the same layer, it's a pretty good chance they were on Earth roughly at the same time frame. If you find, again, organisms in a layer above it, that usually means that they probably came after, or at least died after, right? If you find them below, that usually means that they were probably on Earth before us. And we're talking like thousands and thousands of years when we start looking at these geological timescales. Okay, so if we're going to go through and answer questions, which fossils are older, dinosaurs or jawed fish? Yeah, you go jawed fish, right? Okay, see them right down here. Or sorry, not jawed fish. Here's a jawless fish. Okay. Where are our... Oh, no, there they are. Sorry, they're right there. Okay, I was looking at the jawless fish. Yeah, so you get jawed fish to be older, right? Okay, which, if anything, we remember, we'll talk about evolution on how it basically transferred from water to land, right? Because the first thing they believed on Earth was this ancient green algae floating out in the middle of the ocean. So life had to come from the ocean and eventually go to where? To land, right? And so we would expect to find organisms that could swim in terms of evolution compared to those that basically were able to walk on land. Okay, so the youngest fossils we're going to find where are up here, right? And then the older the fossils are going to be down here. Now, the other part you got to be careful with is we can also understand, or we should also understand at this point in time, that not all layers of the soil are completely flat and in line. Okay, because we know that tectonic plates can do what? They can move. And when they move, sometimes they spread apart, but sometimes they do what? They come together. And if they come together, right, you got those strike slip faults that can usually form mountains, right? And so what you may find is that you may have layers of soil that have basically slipped up over top other ones. Okay. And that's where we got to be careful when you guys are reading like your geological time scales, is because before the strike slip, if these two were the same layers and this one all of a sudden strike slipped over top of it, that doesn't mean because it's rising above this guy right here, it doesn't mean that it's earlier. So you've got to look for those individual bands. You got to look for those colorations. You got to look for certain features that are basically tie these layers of soil in and showing that they basically came or were part of the same time frame. Do we all understand that? Okay. For example, if I basically said that these two layers right here before the strike slip, okay, we're the same, and I'm going to show that they are the same because they have the same structures. Something like this right here, right? This would still be younger soil. That would still be younger soil. And then, again, these two down here would still be, in terms of relative age, they would be older in age. Okay, the only thing that happened is that we had a strike slip fault that basically pushed that other one up over top, right? And you'd still expect to find, again, organisms, right, that came from a later date in those layers of soil. Okay, questions there? You guys are fine? Okay, so fossil records for the most part, all right, just again showing that common timeline. Okay, embryology. All right, study of what? Yeah, you take a look. You guys tell me. We got a fish, we got a salamander, we got a chicken, and we got a human, right? Take a look at the first four. What do you guys see? Talk to me. What do you see? They look the same. After development, are we the same? Now we've got an amphibian. You've got one that can swim. You've got a chicken that can fly and walk at the same time, right? Not at the same time, that'd be really weird. But anyway, at the same organism can fly and can walk, right? You've got humans, again, completely different. But when you look back to their developmental patterns, the developmental stages, what do we see? They are all similar. Okay. So again, could that possibly support the whole theory of common ancestry? Do you guys understand how that can? Okay. So the question I have, there's a couple questions here. Okay. One, what causes the differences between the human and the chick and the salamander and the fish as time goes on? And we could really talk specifically about this in terms of what's happening to the body, but I'm talking more bigger scale. What has caused over time the differences between the human and the chick and the salamander and the fish? Yeah. Okay, why? Why do they develop their own features? Because they why does a fish have to develop fish-like characteristics? It lives in the water. Why does the salamander have to develop salamander-like characteristics? Because the environment that it lives in. Why do we develop the characteristics that we do? Because the environment that we live in. So again, when you look back at this, even though you could support that whole common ancestry by looking at those organisms early on, right? Over the course of time, we have all became different, right? Because of the environments that we lived in and certain adaptations that allow us to survive. Now, there's actually four structures, but there are two structures that you'll find common to all vertebrates, right, during their embryological period, right? And number one, the first one we call it a post-anal tail, right? Post meaning what? Say it again. What's post mean? After. So it's after the what? What's it after? The tail after the what? People, it's called a post-anal tail. Where is that tail after? The what? You guys got to take masks off or something. I can't hear what you're saying.
The butt.
The butt. Yes, it is after the anus. Exactly right. Okay. So when you start looking at these tails, again, post-anal tail is referring to after the anus, right? Now you look at us. We at one point in time had a tail, right? Throughout the stage of development, we had a tail, right? It was there. We still have resemblances of a tail called the what? The tailbone. Exactly. We'll talk about that much later. Okay. Fish, obviously the tail becomes the tail, right? Okay. You start looking at salamanders. They have a tail, right? Chickens have kind of a modified. So we all have this post-anal tail. Some where along the lines, though, ours reduces and others become a little bit more predominant. Okay. Two. Pharyngeal pouches is another structure that is found amongst all organisms as a vertebrate in the early stages of development. Okay, so what I've circled there are called the pharyngeal, Pharyngeal pouches. These are also known as gill slits. So guess what they become in fish over the course of developmental time or period? They become gills. Good. Nice job there. Excellent. They become gills. Okay. How about humans? What do you suppose they become? Wow. How do you know that? There you go. All right. You're exactly right. So they become ears. Most of the people, when they see that, they basically say, well, if they become gills in the fish, they probably become our what? Yeah, they think lungs right off the bat, but it becomes ears, exactly. All right, and so our inner ears. Okay, so again, we start looking at some of these structures that you eventually have, but over the course of time, they obviously develop into something a little bit different, usually based on the environment again that we've lived in or that we've been part of, for the last, how many thousands of years. Okay, so I mean, could you use embryology to show common ancestry? Yeah, I mean, we're all developed basically the same. We basically all start out kind of very similar to each other. There are structures that we all have, even though over the course of time, right, we look nothing like a chicken. We look nothing like a salamander, and we look nothing like a like a fish over time. So we can, again, tie in embryology. We can also use this process of natural selection to go with that. Okay. All right. So I'm going to go on. Now, a couple of the other ones we're going to hammer out today. Okay. Homologous structures versus analogous structures. Okay. So when I bring up the word homologous, homo means what? Same. Okay. So when we look at this term, they have the same developmental pattern, but they are not the same function. Okay. So for example, we're going to be utilizing, I don't know, whatever I think we've called him Richard in the past, Roberto, or whatever you want to name the skeleton, right up here. We've also got obviously some pictures over here. If we take a look at individuals, human, for example, that use their arms for grasping. If we look at example of like a dog or sheep that use their hands, their arms for running, right? They're quadrupeds, okay? If we've got something like a dolphin, for example, or whale that uses them for swimming, and then we've got, birds and pterodactyls and bats that basically use them for flying. Obviously, completely different function, right? One uses it to swim, one uses it to fly, one uses it to run, one uses it to grasp. If we break down the actual makeup, okay, the anatomy of those individuals, what we will find is that there is still the same structures that we'll find in the grasping organisms compared to those that fly, compared to those that swim, compared to those that run. For example, in our arm, okay, bone up here called the what? It's not the muscle, the bone. It even gives it to you right here. What's that bone called? Oh, we got a little work to do. And it's called the humerus. Very good. Okay. So if you take a look at the humerus that we have in our arm, okay, upper arm, you go to a dog, guess what a dog has? It's got a humerus. Okay. Guess what a dolphin has? It's got a humerus. Okay. Guess what a pterodactyl and a bird have? They've got a humerus. Okay. If you break down the two bones that make up our forearm, okay, radius and ulna, right? Okay. So with the radius and the ulna, two bones. Okay. Guess what? Oh, look at that bird. Radius and ulna. Crazy how that works out. Look at that. Sheep. They got a radius and ulna. They got, oh my God, look at all those organisms. They have a radius and ulna. Okay. We go look at our carpals and our metacarpals and our phalanges, right? Phalanges would be the fingers. Metacarpals would be the bones that make up the actual hand. Then you've got the carpals that make up the bones of the wrist. Guess what? They all have them. Okay. Now, maybe a little bit different length, maybe a little bit different shape, not much, right? But they still have them. So again, when you look at the whole terms of common ancestry, could that be used? Well, how is exactly that a dolphin has the exact same anatomical structure in the arm that we do? That's more of a rhetorical question, right? I mean, it's a good question. Is it by coincidence? Could be, right? But again, it's not. So then the other question is, well, why did they develop a different function? And it all comes back to what again? The environment that they lived in, right? What they needed to basically develop into in order to survive at that point in time. Okay? So you've got, again, homologous structures. Now, the other term that comes up is called analogous. Okay? And analogous basically is referring to structures that have different development, but it's the same function. Okay? So, for example, if you take a bird wing and an insect wing, there's differences in development. How? Yeah. Insects don't have what? They don't have bones. Exactly. So if they don't have bones, there's nothing the same about basically their anatomy compared to that of a bird. Birds have bones. They don't have bones. But what do they both do? They both fly. Okay, so the question here is, well, how does this really show, again, evolution? And this isn't so much about common ancestry. This is more along the lines of if you've got organisms with completely different development, but yet they both can fly, again, it's showing what we call more of a convergent evolution, which we'll talk about that stuff a little bit later down the line. All right, again, it's just showing that there are some different, I mean, they basically can utilize the same type of approach in order to survive, right? Even though completely different development. Okay. And so again, we're kind of looking back at natural selection as terms of based on the environment that they live in, right? Those were the adaptations that they needed in order to survive. So you've got analogous structures that can also be used, okay? And again, we can break this down here, basically the arms of the bat, the mouse, and the human, right? And then look at the analogous structures of the bird wing, the butterfly, and then the bat wings itself, right? One has skin, one has feathers, okay? One doesn't have bones, right? But yet they all can fly, okay? Now, the vestigial structures comes in, right? In that you've got organs that do not seem to have a function in an organism, but yet they do in others. So for us, the appendix. Okay, and there's a lot of research being done on the appendix these days. There are some research out there feel that there is a really big importance with the appendix in our body, but it's more at an adolescent stage. As we grow, we don't really need it as much. We can get rid of our appendix. Does it have any impact on us whatsoever? No, it serves no purpose. Okay, but if you go to a rabbit, they have the exact same structure, and it's called a cecum. Okay, and that cecum aids in digestion. So that same structure works in a rabbit, but it doesn't serve a purpose in us. Okay, what about the tail? Do we have a tail? I mean, you can answer that yes, you can answer that no, and I think you'd both be right. Okay, the case of do we have a tailbone, which was a remnants of a tail, right? So we've got these structures that we have, but we don't use them. Why? Why would we have them? Why would our body waste energy on something that we don't use? Say it again. What do you mean? Who's talking right now? I can't even tell who's talking. Okay, McCall, what you got? Yeah, so environment changes. What happened? Yeah, we adapt to it, right? And so maybe the environment that we're living in now, as far as humans, we don't require a tail, right? We don't require appendix, whatever the case is. Maybe you look 150,000 years ago, we were hunters and we were gatherers more than we were hunters. So if it aids in a rabbit's digestion, rabbits are primarily what? Herbivores or carnivores? They're herbivores. So therefore they may be needed because they are herbivores. Maybe at one point in time we were strictly an herbivore, but now we have transitioned to an, not a carnivore, I would say what? An omnivore, right? To where now maybe that cecum doesn't really have a purpose in our digestive system. Same thing with the tails. You know, if you want to take the whole transition, right, from the chimps and the monkeys to where we are right now, there's probably one of your biggest things besides looking at DNA sequences, which we'll talk about again tomorrow. But again, when you take a look at it, they have a tail. We kind of do too, right? And there's people out there, if you look it up, it's weird, okay? Sorry, bad term to use. It's different, okay? There's people out there where their tailbone actually does stick out around, 4 to 5 to 6 inches outside of their so-called buttocks, okay? You probably don't see it so many people because for the most part, it's a detriment. They probably get it ground down or get it taken off, but it's there. It's there. So again, could it be possible that thousands of years ago we needed a tail? Now we don't. Did we develop from something that had a tail? Now we don't need it. And the question is, why wouldn't we need a tail? Say it again. Okay, so look at what tails are used for, right? Well, tails can be used to climb or to hold on to something, no doubt about that, right? They can be used for protection, right? You look at reptiles a lot; they have them basically for using them in a battle and so on. Okay, but what do tails hold, how do they help most quadrupeds? Yeah, balance, exactly. Okay, so when you start looking at reptiles, for example, reptiles have tails. Right? Not all of them, most of them, they have tails, but their feet are where? They're out. If you look at a crocodile and alligator, their feet are out from their body, right? So think about a vehicle. Are you better to have wheels that are out further on an automobile or underneath if we're talking about balance and stability? Out further. Okay? Yeah, because now you're more stable, right? Okay? However, as far as in human body goes, right, or as far as animal goes, the further out you put them, they may be more stable, but they can't move as quickly, which is why if you start looking at leopards and you start looking at more predatory organisms, right, where are their feet at compared to their body? Directly underneath them. But when you put those arms underneath, what happens to the balance and stability? It's like riding on a motorcycle. What happens? Yeah, you lose that stability, right? You start losing a little bit of that balance. So what do they have to help? Riley already told us they have a tail to help with that balance. Why wouldn't we need a tail anymore? We don't walk on four, do we? We've got two. Okay. Now we also developed something else to aid in our balance. And what is that? Okay. I like the big toe. Somebody brought that up in first period today. I 100% agree with that. Not one I would have brought up ever, but you're exactly right. Our big toes actually aid in our balance. Good. What else? Nah, we can utilize them. Don't disagree there. But now, say it again. What, legs? No. Oh, what gives you balance? What inside your head? No. Your ears. Your inner ears. Okay. Why do you become dizzy? Why do you become disoriented? Because you've got basically, I wouldn't say it's a chemical imbalance, but you've got an imbalance going on within your inner ear. Okay. Which is usually, if you get motion sickness, okay, your motion sickness is because of, again, that kind of that imbalance that you're going to find in your inner ear. So we have ways to aid with that balance and stability within our body because we're standing upright, right? I mean, it's easy. Big trees fall hard. Okay. It'd probably be better if we're closer to the ground and have 4 feet underneath us, but we don't. Right. And so again, we've got inner ears. We don't walk on our 4 legs anymore. So there's a lot of things that have basically, I shouldn't say anymore because whatever. All right. But again, a lot of things that have transitioned. So again, the question comes up, if we know that our body is 100% efficient, about as close as you get, we're not 100% efficient, but as close as you could possibly get, why would we waste energy on building something that we don't need? It's kind of a rhetorical question, but I'm interested to hear what you got to say. Yeah, I mean, that could be the one thing. Maybe we need it. I mean, once you kind of lose it, you kind of lose it. I don't disagree with that. Or maybe at one point in time, we needed it, and now we're kind of slowly starting to do what? Get rid of it. Exactly. Okay, which is why, again, you take this 2-foot-long tail, which now could be transitioning down to basically nothing. And who's to say that in the next thousands of years that we don't even have a tailbone anymore, right? So, I mean, when you kind of look at this stuff, it's a lot of conceptual base. I mean, it's a lot of like you've kind of have to get the thought process going a little bit to really understand, how this is helping to provide evidence. But in my mind, it always comes back to one, natural selection, right? It always comes back to, again, organisms are different. Why? Because of the environment that they're living in, right? But we can also look back at this whole common ancestry and show what are some ways that you could tie in how we all maybe came from the same organism back in the day. Okay. Could we have developed from the same organism that a rabbit did? They've got a cecum. We got an appendix. They've got similar body structures as we do. Coincidence? Could be. I mean, again, nobody knows, right? Could be. Absolutely 100% could be coincidence. All right. But again, who really knows at that point in time? Okay. Now, I'm going to be done.